Please be seated. In the vacuum of the gospel reading, James and John look like utter self-centered fools, all focused on themselves, wanting to be at Jesus' left and right hand in power. But in the context of Mark's gospel, there are other things to consider. You see, there are a few verses between last week's wealthy man story and what we got this morning. But to get the full picture, we have to go back to chapter 8. And in Mark's chapter 8, we have a moment where Jesus is gathering with his disciples, and he says, "Who are the crowds say that I am?" And they offer some things, and "Who do you say I am?" And Peter says, "You're the Messiah, the Son of God." To which Jesus then gives voice to what's going to happen to him. The cross and death. And Peter won't have any of this. He rebukes Jesus, says it must not be this way. And Jesus, in turn, calls him Satan. So fair to say, Peter did not do well in that grand context of things. So when later in chapter 9, Jesus says something similar about what's going to happen to him, the disciples learn a thing or two. And they say nothing. The text says they didn't understand, and they were afraid to ask him. Now comes the third time where Jesus says this. Right after the events of the wealthy man, where he's talking about the first will be, some were first will be last, and some will last be first. Jesus, we are told, is on the road going up to Jerusalem, and he's walking ahead of the disciples. And we are told that the disciples and the crowds were amazed, but also afraid. More on that later. But then Jesus takes the 12 aside again and begins to tell them what's going to happen to them, saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death, and they will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit upon him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he'll rise again." Now, right after speaking this terrible fate, that's when James and John make their request. Now, it's understandable that most people would condemn their words, assuming they simply want power. But consider this. The Gospel of Mark is all about threes. The third time is often the charm. Now, actually, I don't know if that statement, third time is a charm, comes from Mark's Gospel, existed before, or existed later. But it holds true. It's the third time where they start to understand. They see Jesus on the way to Jerusalem, which is amazing and terrifying, because Jesus is going into direct conflict with the temple leaders and thus the Romans. It is not unreasonable to conclude that James and John have finally figured out some of what's about to happen. The light bulb has gone on. And rather than cower or be worried about what might happen to them, they say to Jesus, "We have a request. Will you grant it to us?" You know, they're doing the thing a student does with a teacher sometime. Knowing the teacher's probably going to say no, they try and sort of slide in there. But their request is to stand with Jesus. That's their real request. It's not really about heavenly power. It's to say, we see what you are doing, and we're ready to stand with you. And Jesus wants to make things clear. He says, I don't think you know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I baptize? And they say clearly, we are able. Honestly, I think Jesus is pleased by that answer. He says, the cup that I will drink, you will drink, and the baptism which I am baptized, you will be baptized. That's an affirmation of their words, their willingness to stand with him. Now, he does say that it's not in my power to grant you who sits at my left hand or my right hand. And there's a couple of theories about this. One is, yes, indeed, heavenly power. Jesus becomes the king, and those who sit at the left and right of him would be his most trusted advisors, or perhaps his lieutenants. But there's another possibility. In light of the gospel tradition, where Jesus is crucified with one person on his left and one person on his right, one would assume that those would be his followers. But of course, that's not the way the story goes. But I think we can see James and John and their desire to stand with Jesus and finally say the disciples are having a good moment, which is not the way they're usually presented. Now, this victory doesn't last very long because the other 10 get furious with James and John because they see it as a power grab. Whether it's them doing what they should have done or trying to vault over them, they are furious with James and John. And that's when Jesus issues the challenging words that we hear this morning. Whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. The question of service becomes the critical point. The Gospel of Mark clearly asserts, and it's the heart of today's text, that we are always serving someone or something, whether we know it or not. In words from 2015 that have chillingly manifested themselves in our American culture during this pandemic, Pastor David Lose wrote this: one of the most pernicious illusions of our culture is that we are indeed free and autonomous beings who can live independent of all bonds of loyalty, devotion, and service. In fact, I shudder to think how much time and energy we expend in service to, yes, in service to, the idea that we don't serve anyone. It is in this framework where all of the personal freedom arguments lay, that we bear no responsibility to others, that we should be able to do whatever we want, and that we can ignore rules that serve the common good in the name of personal choice. Personal freedom rhetoric tends to be self-serving, either by obtaining power for personal use or by resisting those in authority whose direction counters our perceived own self-interest. Jesus makes it clear that he intends to stand for what is right, even if it's likely to get him killed. It's not an attempt to gain more power. It's not an attempt to pay a debt to God for sins. Rather, Jesus stands against the misuse of power that the Romans have been leading. He uses his voice to testify to God's love and hope for creation. And ultimately, as he says to James and John, the disciples and all of us must make similar decisions in our own due time. David Lose calls the question: who will you serve? The voices of the culture that say that you can be free, indeed must be free on your own at any cost? Or the voice of Jesus that calls you to find your freedom and indeed your true self through service to neighbor? Gross concludes, Jesus' whole life, including his self-sacrificing death, challenges not only our assumptions, but the very powers that be, with surprising and life-giving revelation that as we lose ourselves in service, we find ourselves living more fully than ever before. It's an example and sacrifice validated in the resurrection, and for that matter, in our own experience, as we give ourselves away in service and love, only to discover a depth and quality of life we never have experienced before. That's what Jesus was pleading with the wealthy young man the other week. Give away all your stuff because it's keeping you personally, from living the life that God has called you in the serving of others. And I hear in your voice, I know you want to do this. But in your case, your wealth is defining your worthiness in God's eyes. And anything that defines your worthiness to God, rather than simply being beloved creation, moves away from the hope for us all. That hope that Jesus has is for all his disciples, James and John and the rest, that they will all find their voice and stand for the vision and hope of God. That's not about obtaining power, but using one's power as belovedly made in the image of God for justice and peace for all. And I believe that is Jesus' hope for us as well. Thanks be to God.